very good evening to all our viewers, and we meet again on yet another edition of Vantage Point, where we speak about issues at hand that are of national importance. And today we have Dr. Jayatilaka, political analyst, to speak about those issues that needs the attention, the undivided attention of the people. A very good evening to you, Dr. Dayan.
Good evening, Stephanie.
And today I just wanted to divert our attention towards something that really doesn't get our attention. On our day-to-day life, we call ourselves a democratic country, we call ourselves a socialist country. That's the reason why we have the
passport, on the passport.
Yes, on the passport, the Democratic Republic, Socialist Republic of Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
My question to you, my question to you is, are we what we say we are? Do we have that balance? A democratic republic, socialist country. Are we what we are, or what we call ourselves?
Well, we're certainly not socialist. It was President Jayawardeneh who included the term socialist in the definition. Ironically, the center-left government of the SLFP, the LSSP and the CP named Sri Lanka the Republic of Sri Lanka with the 1972 constitution. It is President Jayawardeneh who was to the right of the SLFP, who retitled Sri Lanka the Democratic Socialist Republic of Sri Lanka with the new constitution of 1978. Now, some thought that he was doing it with his tongue in his cheek. I don't think so. I think he understood that though he had won a massive 5/6 majority in the parliament, the sentiments of the people were still progressive or left of center. That was the political culture of Sri Lanka at that time. And he decided to acknowledge that by going one better than Mrs. Bandanayake and including the term socialist in the definition. That's why we have it on our passport. But no, we are no kind of socialist country. We've never been that way. We have been a social welfarist state. So that's the closest we've come to socialism. Democracy, I would say yes, though it has been a flawed democracy. If you look around the whole of the global south, the third world, Sri Lanka is one of the few countries that has never been under military rule at all. I mean, from the Philippines, Indonesia, through Pakistan, excepting India, of course, through the Middle East to Latin America, many countries of the global south and quite a few in the north, in the global north, Greece, Turkey, Portugal, Spain, they've been under military dictatorships, but not Sri Lanka. So I would say that yes, we've been pretty consistently democratic, though it's not been an exemplary democracy. A republic, yes, that has been a very important change from 1972. We've had the 72 Republic, we've had the 78 Republic, but the real test of whether we are a republic in the full sense of the word comes up with the implementation of the Geneva Resolution. Because it would be difficult to argue that if we do incorporate foreign judges in a special court, that we are still a republic, because that would indicate that we prioritize the international commitments that we have entered into over and above the republican character of Sri Lanka. So that remains to be seen, just how much of a republic we are, whether we are turning back, whether we are turning away from that republican character. But so far we've been a democratic republic, I would say so, yes.
And now that you spoke about the country being a republic, and how you spoke about how we would want to incorporate international judges, that's through the Geneva Resolution.
Yeah.
Do you think the government would have employed a different alternative instead of saying yes to the US resolution and saying yes to international judges and Commonwealth judges to tackle this issue? Do you think we would have used some other alternative instead of using the court, which could be, established with by comprising other international judges? Do you think we would have gone into a different alternative?
Oh, most certainly. Most certainly. And it's commonsensical. Now, what the Geneva Resolution does is to base itself on and actually welcome High Commissioner Zaid Al Hussein's report. Now, as we discussed on this program, that report is quite a damning indictment of the last stages of the war in which the Sri Lankan army prevailed over the Tigers. Now, what we should have done, that's a 260-page report. We should have said, look, we need time to study this. You can't just present us with a 260-page report of such a drastic character. Give us a couple of days and then move a resolution. We've got to take this back to Sri Lanka. Our cabinet has to study this in the first place. We've got to put this to Parliament, and we'll get back to you at the next session. In the meantime, there's something we have which we'd like you to take a look at, which is the Maxwell Paranagama Second Mandate Report, which had really renowned international experts, lawyers and others making inputs. Now, the Paranagama report was handed over in August. That report, which is now in the public domain, has only one annexure. And that annexure is a very important one. It's 30 pages long. It's by the former commander of the legendary British SAS, the Special Air Service, Sir John Holmes. He later became the director of UK Special Operations. So all of the special operations and the special forces of Britain came under Sir John Holmes, OBE. His 30-page report on the last stages of Sri Lanka's war are an absolutely superb analysis. The report is an absolutely superb analysis. I mean, he says no other army that he can think of faced the situation that the Sri Lankan army did, because we had a minimum of 5,000 suicide bombers, Tigers, who had surrounded themselves with about 300,000 civilians. And Sir John says that if the Sri Lankan army had looked around for some inspiration from some other part of the world as to how to handle this kind of situation, it could not have found it. There have been hostage situations, but never one this large. Sir John goes on to say that not even the best equipped and best trained armies in the world could have faced this situation easily, and as well as the Sri Lankan army. And he says, look, there is no way that the Sri Lankan armed forces deliberately tried to kill Tamil civilians, because it didn't make sense. If they had done so, there would have been an international intervention. India would have intervened, the world would have intervened. So it was not in the interest of the Sri Lankan armed forces to deliberately kill Tamil civilians. What they wanted to do was to finish off the Tigers. And they did it as best as they could, given the fact that the Tigers were using artillery from within the no-fire zone. So John says, yes, there were civilians, but nowhere in international law does it say that just because a terrorist surrounds himself with civilians, that you can't target the terrorist, or that you can't target that artillery. He says 250,000 Tamil civilians were rescued. If the Sri Lankan army wanted to deliberately kill Tamil civilians, they could have killed them all in 3 days of shelling. So it's a brilliant analysis by the former head of the British SAS and the former director of British Special Operations. Now, this report is the annexure of the Paranagama report. I don't understand why the Sri Lankan government didn't present the Paranagama report with Sir John Holmes' annexure in Geneva, because even Britain, which was a driving force behind the Geneva resolution, would have found it very difficult to proceed with that resolution, having read what their own expert, the former head of their own SAS had to say about the last stages of the Sri Lankan war. So there was an option. It's not a very radical option. It's not a confrontationist option. It's a very commonsensical option. You're presented with a very serious report by Zaid al-Hussein. What do? You don't embrace it readily. You don't co-sponsor a resolution which welcomes the Zaid report. What you do is say, look, we need to study this. And then you say, here's something of ours. You take a look at that, we'll take a look at this, and let's come back at the next session and arrive at a compromise and a consensus. But the Sri Lankan government chose not to do that.
So do you think the government gave in to international pressure right away?
I don't think so. I don't think so, Stephanie, because
there were contradictory statements that were made. One in Sri Lanka and one in the United States, where almost like it felt the government was just feeding into the national way of thinking. Like the country wants something else, so they were just catering to the population, people who voted them in. And in the United States, they made a different statement which could cater to them.
I think there was a zigzag. There was a zigzag, because what do we know from newspaper reports? We know that a high-powered American team came over here, Assistant Secretary Nisha Biswal, Ambassador-designate Atul Keshap, but also Assistant Secretary for Law and Human Rights Tom Malinowski. That team said two different things. Nisha Biswal and Atul Keshap talked about a credible domestic mechanism, which seemed kind of okay. Tom Malinowski, however, was tweeting that no, it would require some international participation in order to be credible. So there was a split in the American team. Then you had the US draft, the resolution, the first draft of September 24, if I remember. Now, that was a bit of a shocker, because it didn't talk about a credible domestic mechanism. The US draft resolution took on board what Zaid al-Hussein said. And Zaid al-Hussein called for international judges. He called for a hybrid court. So the American resolution didn't use the term hybrid, but had exactly the same description, which is foreign judges, foreign prosecutors, foreign defense counsel, foreign investigators. I think the government of Sri Lanka was a little shocked by that. And I say that because our team in Geneva, headed by two ambassadors, Ambassador Ari Singh, and they quite rightly brought in our ambassador from Vienna, Ambassador Aziz, I think it is. The two of them started negotiating, and they made some very good points. They were trying to water down the draft. I thought that was the right way to go, though I would have, had I been there, insisted on tabling the Paranagama report, as I said, as an alternative point of view. But still, it was correct to start negotiating and going through the US draft with a fine-tooth comb. Then something happened. And we know something happened because Darisha Bastian of the daily FT was reporting from Geneva. And we also have a report in the Sunday Times of Colombo. Prime Minister Vikram Singh was contacted by elements in the West who were surprised that the Sri Lankan government negotiators were trying to dilute the resolution. And Prime Minister Vikram Singh had then overridden the foreign ministry team and insisted that we sign up to the US resolution. Now that's what's in the newspapers, which are not pro-opposition. These are newspapers which have been sympathetic to the UNF government. So it looks like there was a zigzag. Something else happened which was very interesting. While the negotiations were going on, Mr. M.A. Sumandran, MP of the Tamil National Alliance, went across to New York and met the US ambassador and permanent representative to the Security Council, Samantha Power. Now that's very unusual, because when the US is moving a resolution concerning a country, the top ambassador in New York may meet the foreign minister of that country. But instead, Samantha Power didn't meet anyone from the government of Sri Lanka. She gave an appointment to Mr. Sumandran of the TNA. Now what he said was not a secret, because he told the press what he said. And he had insisted on behalf of the TNA that there has to be international participation, that the TNA was opposed to the idea of a purely domestic inquiry mechanism. And he had used the Zaid al-Hussein report to argue that the United States resolution should insist on international participation. Now that seems to have worked, because the Americans seem to have shifted their stance from what Nisha Biswal was saying. And on this side, Prime Minister Wickremesinghe overrode the foreign ministry negotiators and said, no, you go ahead and you sign up to this resolution. Prime Minister Wickremesinghe at a dinner, at a SEMA dinner, thanked the British High Commissioner in Sri Lanka for the role he played in mediation. Now, I would have thought that if there were friendly mediation, the language should have been diluted much further, and that Sri Lanka should have been given more time, because it's a new government. But no, it was a fairly tough resolution, and Sri Lanka has unprecedentedly signed up to this. I was very tickled, really, to read something by an activist of the Tamil diaspora, Mr. S. Kirubakaran. Kirubakaran is based in France. He has been a severe critic of the Sri Lankan government for a long time. He used to turn up in Geneva when I was serving there as well. And he's written a piece to the Colombo Telegraph where he says that for 25 years he has been a lobbyist who has attended the sessions of the UN Human Rights Commission at that time, and then the UN Human Rights Council. And he says for the first time in 25 years, he saw the country concerned, the country about which the resolution is being brought, actually turning around and co-signing the resolution itself. So what happened is something that is unprecedented in diplomacy. And I really don't see how that was a smart move.
And Dr. Dayal, do you think the country has in fact made progress? Because the earlier administration, during the earlier administration, we were in Geneva, but we went for a vote and we were defeated. But in that sense, don't you think the government that's there at present has made progress when it comes to the resolution, and even though it co-sponsored a resolution, it was able to finally dilute the language, dilute the draft itself. So don't you think the government has made progress in comparison to the former administration?
Well, I don't think the language was diluted, because if the language was diluted, you couldn't have the clause about the Commonwealth and foreign judges, foreign investigators, foreign prosecutors. So the dilution, if at all, has been minimal. The best evidence of this is that among those who co-sponsored the resolution, there isn't a single Asian country. I mean, even India didn't co-sponsor this resolution. No non-aligned countries, no Asian countries, no country in the region, in our region, not even India, wanted to touch it. They didn't co-sponsor this. It is entirely the West plus Sri Lanka. So that doesn't tell me that that's any kind of improved performance. Now, the previous government, you have to understand there are two stages in the foreign policy of the Rajapaksa administration. The first stage during the war, it's still being written about academically, because Western academics are studying how that government successfully concluded the war while keeping international intervention at bay. There's I was sent a PhD thesis by a postdoctoral fellow. She's now a postdoctoral fellow, and you're studying international relations, so you'd be interested in this. It's a young woman called Kimberly Nackers. She's a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Queensland. And she's been studying Sri Lanka's foreign policy during the war through her master's. And she did a PhD thesis on it, and now she's a postdoctoral fellow. Coming out of the thesis, there's an article which has appeared in a scholarly journal, which is how I got to know about it, because it mentions me as well. And here's a young Western scholar doing a PhD and submitting articles which are published in academic journals about how the Rajapaksa administration successfully warded off responsibility to protect the R2P humanitarian intervention and finished the war successfully, and got an endorsement at the UN Human Rights Council in May 2009. So that period was successful. That was the first term. Then you had the second term, and the second term, the post-war term, was a disaster in terms of foreign policy. However, there's an old joke about Sri Lanka's diplomacy, because in 1987 we did something similar. We went along with a consensus resolution at the UN Human Rights Commission, and the joke was that, do you prefer somebody calling you a war criminal, and there are several people who get together and say, yeah, you're a war criminal, and then you have a few friends and they say, no, you're not a war criminal, you're a good guy, and you prefer to go for a vote and lose that vote, but you still have 10-15 people who say, no, you're not a war criminal, and some people say, no, he is or she is a war criminal. Do you prefer that, or do you prefer not to have a vote, and you also agree, yes, I am a war criminal, so let's all get together and agree that I'm a war criminal? Now that's what happened this time in October 2015. We agreed, we co-sponsored the US resolution, which commences by welcoming and promising to implement Zaid al-Hussein's report, which says that we committed system crimes, that the entire Sri Lankan state system deliberately targeted Tamil civilians in large numbers in the last stages of the war, and that it was so big, so huge, that the Sri Lankan court system can't deal with it. Now, why would we do that to ourselves? And surely when not even India is willing to co-sponsor it, the rest of Asia is not going to touch it, shouldn't we have asked ourselves, why are they not going to co-sponsor this resolution?
But India has always maintained a very neutral position, even when it comes to Sri Lanka. Even during the former administration, when the vote was going on, India didn't support Sri Lanka being an Asian country and being a neighboring country. So don't you think it only makes sense that they didn't want to oppose the US or the US government?
No, they could have gone along with the US, they didn't.
So
you say they didn't co-sponsor this resolution.
So they were maintaining their neutral position on it.
The Indian position was that in up to 2009, actually up to 2011, they voted with us. 2012, they voted against us. 2013, they voted against us. 2014, they abstained. But even in 2014, despite their problems with Mahinda Rajapaksa's government, India in Geneva said they were opposed to this inquiry by the Office of the High Commissioner. Now, why did they do that? Because India knew that this was a precedent which was bad for Asia and the Third World. So, this time, despite India's close relationship with the United States, despite India's close relationship with the new government in Sri Lanka, India and the rest of Asia did not join in signing up to the resolution.
So, or maybe they were threatened that their
Nobody
dirty
can
laundry,
threaten India.
as in their dirty laundry would be exposed.
You mean Kashmir and so
Yes.
on? Well, yes,
And
but
their involvement in the war itself in Sri Lanka.
But when it comes to dirty laundry, Stephanie, I mean, one can go back to Iraq, Afghanistan, the West has far more dirty laundry to launder if it comes to that. And something very interesting happened just 2 weeks ago, which shows that it's just not true that a small developing country can't beat the United States diplomatically. In New York, the Cubans moved a resolution against the United States embargo of Cuba. And there are 193 member states. All 193 voted. Of the 193, 191 voted with Cuba, and that includes Britain, with Cuba against the United States. There were 0 abstentions. And only 2 countries voted in favor of the United States, the United States and Israel. So we're talking about a small island on the doorstep of the mightiest superpower, which every year challenges the US with a resolution in New York and wins by larger and larger and larger numbers. I'm not saying Sri Lanka should have done that. I mean, we did it in May 2009 in Geneva, but I'm not saying that's the model that we should continue to emulate. But we could have cut a much better deal for ourselves. We didn't even try. And that's what surprises me. And I think that is why you see the delay in implementing the resolution, the Geneva resolution, because it's very difficult to do so. Right now, President Sirisena has convened an all-parties conference. Why would he convene an all-parties conference if it's so easy to implement the resolution? I think there are 2 views on this in government. Prime Minister Wickremesinghe and maybe to a slightly lesser extent Foreign Minister Mangala Samaraweera are committed to implementing the Geneva resolution which they co-sponsored. The TNA is pushing them, and in Parliament Mr. Sumandaran made it very clear. He told the government, look, you co-sponsored this, you own it, you have to implement all of it. But on the other hand, President Sirisena convened an all-parties conference, and he's asked those parties to submit their views on this in writing in 2 weeks. So what does that mean? That means that he's not quite convinced, and he knows that he needs all the parties to go along. So the fact that we didn't play for time in Geneva and cut a better deal for ourselves has meant that it's very difficult to implement it here, that there are 2 views in the government itself. Which is why Minister Nimal Saripala de Silva, speaking during the parliamentary debate on Geneva, took a view that was very different from that of the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister. I think the SLFP in government and the UNP have 2 different views on Geneva.
Speaking about the post-war period, which I think is important and most of us do, don't you think the government has made meaningful strides in reconciliation and in bringing back ethnicities that were once divided back together, back on track?
Well, that remains to be seen, because no formal political dialogue has opened. We know from what Mr. Mavai Senadaraja has said, that there are talks between the government and the TNA on a political settlement which would lead to political reconciliation. But we don't know who those talks are with, and they've not come out into the open. Now, the problem that I see is this. I think there's a lot of goodwill. I think there's a sincere effort to resolve the political problems between North and South, or Sinhalese and Tamils, if you want to call it that, this time around. But what I also see is that the government is trying to walk in 2 directions at the same time, which you can't do. In no country in the world have you had accountability and reconciliation together? That's why the Good Friday Accords, which brought peace to Northern Ireland, didn't have any accountability aspect at all. And the IRA, the Sinn Féin, didn't say, look, we've suffered so much, you guys have done so much to us, we need some accountability hearing. There has not been any accountability hearing concerning the Northern Ireland conflict, and nobody asked for it.
So do you think
Why?
the government wanted to go for that, resort to that, because then it will not look weak in the public's eye? Bringing accountability is good. It makes the government look stable.
No, in fact, it will make the government extremely unstable because the SLFP won't agree with
So
the
this is
UNP.
accountability on part of the government, on part of
The armed forces.
the armed forces,
It's
and on part of LTT as well.
Yeah, but the LTT is dead, and the other guys are overseas, and nobody's going to be able to bring them back to stand trial here. Because they'll say, look, we'll be tortured if we go back to Sri Lanka. So the one side has been wiped out. So the accountability, the guys who are going to have to answer questions are the ones who won the war. Imagine a situation where, on the one hand, you hope to have political reconciliation, which means constitutional change. You're talking to the TNA. You've released political prisoners or those who are held prisoner under the PTA. But on the other hand, you're hauling up armed forces guys and you're asking them, what did you do? Why did you do it? Wasn't there a different way of doing this and so on? So, simply put, Stephanie, reconciliation means you have to put the war behind you. Otherwise, you can't reconcile. It's like two people. If you want to reconcile, you can't keep on talking about the past. The famous actress Marlene Dietrich said, she was asked, what kind of advice would you give women? Well, at that time it was women. And she said, don't warm up a man's sins for breakfast. So, if you want to have a good relationship, you can't keep talking the next morning about all the bad things that happened before. Similarly, if you want reconciliation between two communities, you have to put the war behind you. Allow the war to be dealt with in the arts and in dialogues between young people and so on. But you don't rake up that past. Because if you rake up that past, it's going to polarize again. The Sinhalese are going to say, hey, what about Anuradhapura, Nayaru, Kokilai, Habarana, Arantalava, Peta, Maradana, etc., etc., etc. Who's accountable for that? What about what the Tigers did? What about what happened to us? And the Tamils are going to say, well, what about, A, B, C, D, and E? And you're going to relive the war all over again, but you should be putting it behind you. So, the government has made commitments which are completely contrary to each other. The logic of reconciliation is to put the war behind you and move forward. The logic of accountability is to revisit the war and literally dig up the bones. Now, if you go one way, you're really going to make people angry at each other all over again. Because it's going to be our boys versus our boys. Our army, how dare you? So, I think that though the government has the goodwill and maybe the political commitment to move on ethnic reconciliation, the other commitment it has made on a high-profile accountability process undermines the first commitment. And that's the problem that I see. I don't see the government being able to move on both. It's always a choice. In any country, the reason they don't move on accountability is that they want to move forward and reconcile, to heal the wounds in society. You can't heal the wounds in society by picking at the scabs.
Police brutality, now that has been the center, has taken center stage, where we see many university students who were demonstrating were subject to police brutality. Do you think there is some political backing over this, or does this happening just because they want their rights or their needs to be met?
Well, again, every government does this. Whenever there's a demonstration and there's violence on the part of the police, the government says, that's very bad, but who was behind the demonstration? And then the opposition says, who was behind the baton charging? Look, the Inter-University Student Federation, the political forces behind it it's no secret, it's never been a secret. From its inception, the Inter-University Student Federation had been backed by the JVP. That changed a few years ago because there was a split in the JVP. And the group that broke away is the FSP, the Frontline Socialist Party, also known in Sinhalese as the Peratugami. And they are the political guides or leaders of the Inter-University Student Federation. That's not a secret. But it's also irrelevant. The Inter-University Student Federation has always had politics. Everywhere in the world, student movements are politicized. I can't think of a single student movement anywhere in the world that doesn't have politics, usually of a left-wing sort, behind it. So, what's the big deal? Now, the FSP does not belong to the parliamentary opposition. So, it has no interest in doing anything that will benefit the present parliamentary opposition. In fact, after the January 8th election, it is the FSP that filed a case, Duminda Nalagama, filed a case against Mahinda Rajapaksa, saying that he tried to deploy the armed forces and sort of do something unconstitutional. The Supreme Court threw out the case. So the FSP is like totally anti-Mahinda Rajapaksa, anti the present joint opposition of Dinesh and all the others. There's no reason for them to have engaged in this protest demonstration in order to benefit the parliament, the opposition in parliament. Doesn't make sense. Now, who is it that told the police, that's another question, to react with violence against what was a non-violent protest? Because we didn't see the students hurling rocks or doing anything against the police. They were demonstrating. They were chanting slogans. And it was perfectly possible to disperse them, if it was necessary to disperse them, with tear gas or water cannon. There was no need to assault them with batons. That baton charge was completely uncalled for. So who gave the order? That's the other question. So this whole thing about who's behind and it doesn't matter who's behind. What you see is what you get. And what you get is, on the one hand, a very disciplined, well-organized student demonstration. I must say that the Inter-University Student Federation over the last few years, perhaps under the guidance of the FSP, looks and behaves like a student movement anywhere in the world. The way they're disciplined, the way they show courage, especially those girls. They showed a lot of courage in the face of police brutality. So hats off to them. And they didn't resort to any violence. But they were beaten up.
And if you can speak a little bit about the subject minister's approach to it.
Well, I'm confused. Who is the subject minister?
Minister Lakshman Kiriyala.
Ah, yes. Minister Lakshman Kiriyala. He first said that the students had no need to demonstrate. But I mean, that's what students do. They demonstrate anywhere in the world. What do you mean, no need to demonstrate? And secondly, that we need to see who was behind this. I mean, it's the same old story. What's the relevance? Whoever was behind it didn't initiate violence. It was an orderly student protest. So, who cares who was behind it? I mean, is he trying to say that there shouldn't be politics in the student movement? Where in the world isn't there politics in the student movement? So I don't get his point. I don't think he was successful at all.
And on the other hand, we have the Prime Minister requesting for a report into the measures that were employed by the police in tackling this protest.
Well, Prime Minister Wickremesinghe, even as leader of the UNP, usually calls for a report, and not much happens as a result of those reports. But I was very impressed by the leader of the opposition, Mr. Sambandhan. He did very well, and I remember that in 1980, when Prime Minister Wickremesinghe was the Minister of Education, he brought a white paper on education reform, which was really perceived as an attempt to privatize education. And there were huge student demonstrations. I mean, this is an old story. Wherever Mr. Wickremesinghe is, there are always student demonstrations. And those students were baton charged on Golface Green by mounted police. The students of Katubadda University went on a hunger strike. And Mr. Sambandhan's leader at that time, Mr. Amithalingam, who was also the leader of the opposition, made a very important intervention, and he went to Katubadda, to Morato University, and he solidarized with the students. So Mr. Sambandhan is in that tradition. I think he did very well in Parliament in this debate. Hats off to him.
Well, speaking about Parliament, there's a lot of chaos in Parliament. Even yesterday during the debate, we heard many ministers voicing their opinion from the opposition. There's, in fact, a lot of chaos. The legislature of the country is having so much of chaos happening, and there's not much that's given to the public. What are your views on that?
Yes, that's lamentable, but that again was avoidable. I mean, look at the reality, the truth of it, Stephanie. You have the TNA leading the opposition, which with 16. You have the JVP with what, 5? The TNA and the JVP together are about half of the SLFP and UPFA guys who are in opposition. Because there were 95 UPFA MPs elected on August 17th. Many of them went over to the government of whatever, national government or whatever, unity government. But that leaves around 50, 48 maybe, MPs who are sitting in and behaving as the opposition. Dinesh Gunawardena, Prasanna Ranatunga, and so on. Now, they are not recognized as the opposition. Not only are they not recognized as the opposition, they don't get time to speak. Now, there was a little controversy as to why Mahinda Rajapaksa didn't speak in Parliament on the Geneva issue. Now, I don't know why he didn't speak, but I do remember hearing on television that he had been placed number 4 and given 15 minutes. Now, this is the former president of the country. He had only 15 minutes to talk. So, no wonder he didn't speak. He went to Aberame and spoke before the cameras there. So, when you have 48 people who are numerically the largest opposition force, but who have to beg for 4 minutes to speak, then naturally they are going to get frustrated and restive. So, they manifest their discontent through political theatre in the Parliament. That's the pity of it.
So can this go on? For how long could this go on?
I don't see it as sustainable, Stephanie. You've asked exactly the right question, because in the first place, there's too much of a load. You have a high-profile, very controversial accountability process coming up with a special court and foreign judges. You have constitutional change, not just reform, a new constitution being promised, which would probably move beyond the 13th Amendment and the framework of the unitary state. The Sunday Times says that Prime Minister Wickremesinghe is going to propose that foreign companies and foreigners be allowed to buy large amounts of land in Sri Lanka. The Sunday Times also says that the Finance Minister, Mr. Ravi Karunalayaka, is going to propose the repeal of the land ceiling of 50 acres, and there's not going to be a ceiling. So, in other words, foreign companies can own a limitless amount of land in Sri Lanka. So, all of these are very controversial. They are bound to cause a rift between the UNP and the SLFP components of the government. And you may find President Sirisena and Prime Minister Wickremesinghe beginning to drift apart on these issues. So I don't see this as something that's sustainable.
Now you brought that whole point up where Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe wants to make amendments to the land laws and
Correct.
all of that. Incidentally, this is happening following the World Bank report that was released last week, called the Doing Business report, where it singled out that Sri Lanka is lagging behind, going down because of the land issue, because Sri Lanka doesn't have regulations. Sri Lanka has stringent regulations on amending land laws. So do you think this was done just to show the World Bank that we are doing something about it?
Well, Stephanie, our rating in the Doing Business report has dropped between the time that Mahinda Rajapaksa was there and now. Now that's something very new. Normally when the UNP comes in, business finds it far more conducive. Now, all the years that Mahinda Rajapaksa was in power, you didn't repeal the land ceiling. The land ceiling remained. But we had a higher rating. It was easier to do business then than it is now under UNP government. So it can't be the land ceiling. The second point is that this land ceiling was brought in 1972, immediately after the April 71 insurrection. And the reason was that the government of that day, having had to suppress the insurrection, asked itself, why did this happen? And one of the reasons was that you had landlessness and you had a big landowning class. So it decided that in order to prevent further social polarization, that it would engage in a land reform and that there would be a ceiling on land holdings. So you had a comfortable landowning upper middle class. I mean, 50 acres is a big deal. I remember Mr. Premadasa, Ranasinghe Premadasa, who was an opposition MP at that time, he made a counter proposal. He was UNP. He said, no, you bring the ceiling down to 5 acres. You don't need more than 5 acres. But the SLFP government said, no, that's too radical. So they brought in this cap on land holdings, so you don't have a huge gap between a big landowning class and those who have very little land or no land at all. So if you reverse that, if you remove the land ceiling, you are going to have huge class polarization in our rural areas. And that's one of the most destabilizing things you can have in any country. If you take Southeast Asia, and I know from our conversation that you're interested in the ASEAN region, one thing about the success, the economic success of the Far East of ASEAN is that they abolished these large landholding classes. Whether it was Taiwan or South Korea, you had land reform so that you didn't have radicalization in the rural areas. And that was one of the, because they were reacting against Chinese communism, so they thought, okay, the only way we can stop this growth of Maoism is to make sure that there's no huge landholding class. So if we dial this back, we are setting ourselves up for a world of pain, of social polarization.
But don't you think this will make way for foreign investment?
Look, Stephanie, we have done one of the most stupid things that we could do, which is to distance ourselves from China, where the foreign investment comes from. Look what the British did, David Cameron, and the Queen, who's quite popular in this government. Usually, when a visiting leader turns up in Britain, he is taken by carriage to have tea with the Queen. But in the case of China's President Xi Jinping, the Queen joined him in the carriage. And they went off for tea together. Nobody has ever treated a foreign visitor in that way. I mean, the Queen has never done that. David Cameron took him for beer. The President of China addressed the two houses of the British Parliament. And finally, the British said, please give us some money. And he signed a check for some huge sum to fund a nuclear power plant. Now, why didn't the British turn to the Americans or their Western friends? Because the British know that the West doesn't have money, and they know who has the money, and it's the Chinese. So the British turned to the Chinese, but we have been distancing ourselves from the Chinese. We've been criticizing the Chinese. Even today we say, well, you know, the Port City project, we're going to have to renegotiate that. Now, having distanced ourselves from the guys who have the money to invest, we are now trying to plug that hole by removing the land ceiling and trying to get foreign investors to come in to our rural areas and set up multinational agribusiness. I remember a time, you probably were not born at that time, when under Jaya Jayawardena, Minister Gamini Dissanayake tried to bring a Malaysian multinational called Guthrie, palm oil, into Sri Lanka, which meant that the land ceiling would have had to be fudged a little bit. You know who led the agitation against that? Chandrika Bandaranaike Kumaratunga. I mean, we were at the same places like the LSSP headquarters. Chandrika, whose academic specialization was in land reform and the agrarian question, she saw the dangers of this. And it was she, even more than Vijay, who led the peasant organizations against multinational agribusiness entering Sri Lanka. So we've cut off the Chinese, we don't have the money, and now we are repealing one of the most progressive reforms that made sure that we didn't have huge class polarization in our rural areas. I think that's a huge blunder.
Dr. Dayan, you just mentioned that the UK rolled out a red carpet to China. But isn't their economy crumbling at the moment?
Not crumbling. It can afford to. At least it can afford to make. It was doing too well. It was overheating, and the Chinese have made course corrections, and their growth rate has dropped a little bit.
But there's the second largest economy.
Yeah, but it's still a lot higher than any other economy. I mean, why did the British turn to the Chinese in this way? The Washington Post, which is a very liberal paper, it usually doesn't shout. The Washington Post accused David Cameron, who's a very right-wing prime minister, of selling out to the Chinese. So the Americans are unhappy. But why did the British do this? They did it because they know who's got the money. And they're hoping that London, as the center of finance, will be a hub for Chinese money. That's how they're hoping to revive the British economy and the city of London. And they're smart, but we've been dumb.
But don't you think, Dr. Dayan, that we need the funds to run the country?
Yeah.
So that's the only way.
The Chinese have the funds.
Why can't we lean towards the World Bank?
They don't have the money.
So if they promised...
If they had the money, they would have bailed out the Greeks.
So do you see a connection between how the World Bank wants us to improve on making reforms to our land laws and how the Prime Minister wants to bring in a new law that will make amendments to the land laws?
Oh, absolutely. But the Prime Minister is being, in that sense, very unrealistic. There's nothing that the World Bank can do for him which is not going to cost him socially here. Because you repeal the land ceiling, you allow a large landowning class, and especially foreign agribusiness, then you're going to face a lot of social unrest and electoral repercussions, not at the forthcoming local government elections, but down the road. And I think that's what's known as a wedge issue. The SLFP has always been very sensitive on land issues, and it will only widen the rift, just as the accountability process. It will widen the rift between the two components of the national unity government, the UNP and the SLFP. So I think it's bad economics and bad politics.
And in the most newest developments to take place in the international arena, before we wrap up, we need to touch on that. The ASEAN Summit. How all the countries refused to give a joint statement at the end of the summit. And in fact, the United States is backing this. What do you think is the connection between the United States sitting besides the 8 member nations and having its own say?
Well, if you go back to the inception of ASEAN decades ago, ASEAN was called into being as a grouping of non-communist Asian countries to counterbalance China and Vietnam, which were both communist-led. So the US was very much supportive of that at the beginning of ASEAN. Things changed drastically. And Vietnam came into ASEAN, the Chinese supported ASEAN, so it became ASEAN plus China, and ASEAN became a high-growth area. But now you have new dynamics. Some of those dynamics are rather like the old dynamics. You have the US pivot to Asia, the US looking at the Pacific and the Indian Ocean region as a higher priority than it had regarded that area before. So the US is back in Asia. Then you have the rise of China and the apprehension of some of the ASEAN powers about that. There's a division. The Philippines is very apprehensive, Vietnam too, but there are other Southeast Asian countries which are not as apprehensive about China. The ones that are apprehensive are trying to use the US to balance off China. But they're also apprehensive about the United States. So it's a new dynamic. It's to do with the US coming back into Asia, it's to do with China rising, and the way, the different ways, not all one way, the different ways in which the countries of Southeast Asia are responding to these new dynamics. That's what you see, and the lack of a final communique shows that there's a deadlock. I mean, it's not going either this way or that. There's a new complexity which has been introduced into what until now seemed like an extremely successful, maybe the most successful growth area in the whole world.
And that was the development in the international arena. But next week when we meet again and we come back to your living room, we'll have more insightful discussions. Like fortnight, yes. We will have more discussions and more stories coming your way. But until we meet again, this is Vantage Point, and I'm Stephanie Lazarus.